Welcome back to the NSE 5 journey. The next section we're going to talk about is the FortiManager system settings. We've already covered the introduction to this video series along with add-ons and the differences between the FortiManager and the FortiAnalyzer. So where are we on the plan? To recap, we've done the FortiManager, the introduction, and now on the FortiManager system settings. This will most likely be a few videos to cover all of this because it's such a big element of the course. So before I go into actually looking at the basic system settings and a default configuration for the FortiManager, I want to take note on the difference between a physical and a virtual machine and different ways you can buy the appliances, and then we're going to look into why you choose one over the other. So physical appliances, when we're thinking about this, we're more interested about the factors and what it can give us. It's more the model element as opposed to the VM, which is driven primarily around the licensing. The physical appliances, you've got to keep in mind form factor. Do you have 1U, 2U? What interfaces do you require? Is it fiber uplinks? Is it RJ45 copper? What storage capacity? Do you need RAID? Are you going to have remote storage? What about hot swappable? Is it going to be hardware or software? Software, hot swappable can't be swapped out while the system's running. Hardware can. Is that important for you? Redundant power supplies. I've just put together two FortiManager examples of two models there. You can see the FortiManager 300D. It has 300 ADOMs or VDOMs, and it can do up to 2 GB a day on logs. Whereas the FortiManager 1000D, again, 2 gig of data a day, which is quite a lot, and of course 1000 VDOMs. As you get to more of the enterprise, the higher end, it can do more than 2 gig a day. The VM differs. It's not so much about the appliance and what it can offer physically, but more the licensing and what the licensing unlocks to the platform. It's designed for EXI, Hyper-V, AWS, and it follows that license model. The basic license for the trial is 10 VDOMs with 1 gig of logs per day, and then you've got the FortiManager VM 5000, 25 gig of logs a day, 5000 VDOMs. Also with the closed network mode, is that going to be important for you? Do you want to have the FortiManager publicly going out network and putting down all the latest signatures and check your web filtering and so forth, or would you rather have all your devices do it itself? Or maybe this particular FortiManager is going to sit somewhere else in your network and report into a larger FortiManager. Those are the sort of things you want to think about when you're looking at what models, or whether you should be VM or it should be physical. The equipment that we have for the video series is actually the VM. It's the 15-day license, which is the FGM VM base. Now I want to touch on a FortiManager use case. What it would look like inside of a company. Now, this particular use case is going to be Enterprise SMB. And after that, I'm going to move on to the Managed Security Service Provider. But for now, let's look at how an Enterprise or SMB would most likely set up their FortiManager. Here we have the HQ with the FortiManagers located at. The HQ most likely has a internet breakout, and from the internet breakout you probably have an array of FortiGates with maybe site-to-site VPNs to one another. Maybe they're actually not VPNs, maybe they're just routing public traffic. Either way, it doesn't matter how they connect back to the HQ, but rather that the HQ holds the FortiManager, or maybe the data center holds the FortiManager, and the remote devices sit on the end there. Now in this sort of deployment, what do we expect to see? All sites being remote, considered branch sites. They're configured with simple deployments, maybe just a default gateway back to site, maybe a really basic policy and firewall deployment with most likely no security profiles. They all report back into the FortiManager, where the FortiManager is being pre-configured with provision templates and scripts to be pushed out to all the sites. The beauty of this is you can send a very basic engineered site to achieve the goal, and you can get it connected up to the FortiManager, and then the remote engineers with the skills and expertise within the FortiGate area can actually connect in and configure it. This uses that top-down management, meaning that all the changes we make will be on the FortiManager and they'll be installed onto the devices, as opposed of being made on the devices and imported into the FortiManager. The firewall policies are most likely common. Each branch is almost identical to the next, depending on other things, of course. Maybe one branch is bigger than the other, maybe it has different services, but 9 out of 10 times in a large deployment, the sites are very similar. Maybe they've got an X amount of PCs, maybe they supply an X amount of services, whatever it may be. Normally the config is very similar, and it's just a case of different IPs. As such, device templates and provision scripts along with policy packages can all be deployed onto the FortiGates from the FortiManager to keep it simple. The next element I want to look about is the Managed Security Provider, the MSSP. In this scenario, we have the data center or HQ again with the FortiManager hosted. This has a link out to the internet with customers or with the ISP's own FortiGates. At the back of this, we may have a private layer 3 MPLS VPN. Each customer connecting into that VPN with their own FortiGates, managed or unmanaged, and they report back into the central FortiManager. The central FortiManager will be most likely split into multiple ADOMs to either give customer access to it, whether that's read or write access. It may be that in this scenario, the customer themselves or whoever it is that within that MPLS may want to manage their own equipment. So this is where we most likely, if anywhere, would use the backup ADOM scenario, where we would allow the configurations to be made directly on the device and synced back into the FortiManager, as opposed to going onto the FortiManager and making those changes and installing it downstream into the device. We keep that ability of scripting, we keep the options of revision tracking and understanding who made those changes in that backup ADOM, so that's a key element that we keep, but we don't have the ability to make any device changes, not without logging into the device itself, and obviously that can be a hindrance if we've got to log into multiple devices, especially if the customer's a large MPLS customer.
So now we have an understanding of the use case scenarios for both the MSSP and Enterprise. I just want to dive a little bit more into what the data center or HQ would look like, where we actually put the FortiManager. It's always best to deploy it behind a firewall and only open necessary ports, and you would normally assign a VIP on a FortiGate. An example of this would be like so. You'd have the internet connection into your HQ, and then from the HQ into the firewall, where you would have a VIP or port forwarding set up downstream into the FortiManager. And what about accessing the FortiManager? There's two methods. There's the CLI, the command line interface, or the GUI, the graphical user interface. The command line interface can be accessed via the local console port using a RJ45 to DB9 cable or a DB9 to DB9 console cable. It can also be accessed via the GUI through the Java, or you can SSH and telnet into the device. And I mentioned in a previous lesson that just like FortiGates, some of the commands can only be done through the CLI. The cable you use is most likely this, where you have the RJ45 at one end, that would go into the FortiManager, and a serial at the other. The graphical user interface, a few things to mention here. You'll be able to get into that by browsing to the IPs that you configure on the FortiManager, and I'll go into in more detail in a moment the default for the FortiManager. But keep in mind that the FortiAnalyze feature set is not enabled by default, therefore the FortiView, the event management and the reports tab will not be visible, and depending on the person logging in and what profile they have been set, they will not have full permission. So an example would be if the standard user or restricted user logs in, they will not be able to see the system settings. So the default settings when you've actually turned on a FortiManager, normally it's port 1 or the management interface, and it has the 192.168.1.99/24, and you would configure a device to be inside that subnet. So you'd have maybe 192.168.1.100. Once you're plugged in, you should be able to browse and actually go into the FortiManager via the GUI because you have HTTP and HTTPS enabled, or you can telnet and SSH to that IP to get in via the CLI. Username and password to authenticate. By default, it's admin or lowercase, and the password will be left as blank. And as I said before, the FortiAnalyze feature set and ADOMs are disabled. It's important once you're into the device, the first thing you do is change that password and make it more complex. To the right there, I've included an image of the default tabs that you'd see when you're logging into the FortiManager. It's recommended to essentially log in with the GUI to begin with, as it's much easier to configure, and the CLI will tend to be used for scripting or for more advanced users. When you're in, the first sort of settings you want to look at is the network settings, and to get there, click on the system settings, network, under the left hand side there, and this will take you into the following screen. What we'll do now is we'll jump into the actual FortiManager and we'll make some of these changes ourselves. Okay, so here we are, just logging into the FortiManager. There's the pop-up for the evaluation because we've only got the base license installed. Now what we'd like to do is configure some basic networking settings, and to achieve this we're going to click on the system settings. We're going to get the overview of the dashboard, and just on the left we're going to go into network. And this was the screen that was displayed in the presentation. You can see here under port 1 the IP address is the 10.200.99.1/24. I have not configured an IPv6 address. As you can see that this particular port is listening on SSH, Telnet, HTTP, ping, and not listening on any IPv6 administrative access because there is no IP. The service access for FortiGuard updates and web filtering anti-spam means that if this device was configured as a FortiGuard, it would actually listen for any devices that is sending it requests for updates, or if it's looking for URL lookups. This here would enable the interface to listen for those. Default gateway, so normally this would be something like this, will mean if this guy does not know how to get to anywhere, he would go to .2 and it will work because they're in the same subnet. However, port 1 is not where my default gateway is. Port 1 is a link into the private network that I have set up here. I actually have another port which is public, which is how I remote into this device. The DNS settings are left by default. If you click on the all interfaces, it will come up with the 4 ports that I have available, and you can see there's my internal port and this is my external port. So port 2 connects into essentially the internet, and from there this is how I get into the device. If we now go back to the network settings, click on routing table, we can have a look at more details how the routing is going to work within the FortiManager. So anything to the 10.203/24 will use the gateway of 10.200.99.254, which is outside port 1, and anything for the 10.02/24 will go out the same gateway out the same port. Anything that's not inside my private network will all be captured by this gateway of last resort or default gateway, and the next hop is a public address outside port 2. IPv6 routing table will show us similar information, but I'm not going to show it because we have no IPs configured. And the last thing we can do on this screen is essentially our basic ping and trace routes to confirm connectivity to certain devices that the FortiManager is trying to reach. And to log out the device, there's a logout button just on the side there. So now we've gone over and had a look at the FortiManager and made some changes. I want to touch base on how we would revert those changes, as in revert the FortiManager back to its factory settings, or if needed actually format the hard drive that FortiManager sits on. The way we would do this is there are 2 commands. To reset, we would use the execute reset all settings, which will return the FortiManager back to its default settings. It's important when you perform these changes that you actually plug directly into the local console. You do not remote in, because obviously if you were to remote in and make these changes, you would lose connectivity. Performing the execute reset all -settings command will reset the FortiManager back to its default settings, erase the configuration on the flash, including the IPs and routes, disconnect all sessions and reboot the FortiManager. Essentially, this is a factory restore. The execute format command will delete all the database logs and repartition the hard drive, along with deleting all the configurations, templates and so forth. The execute format has additional switches, which include the RAID level, if applicable, and the deep arrays option. To back up the FortiManager, we would do this through the system settings and the system information widget. It would actually look similar to this. You can see here I've just selected the backup option within the system configuration section on the system widget, and it's come up asking me whether I want to encrypt the configuration, and if I do, just enter a password. If you enter the password, do not forget it, because you cannot unencrypt this to restore it. This will back up the flash configuration and the database and all device information. It will not back up things like the FDS objects or firmware images. If you do want to use a scheduled backup, you have to perform this via the CLI, and to the right there I've put in the configuration strings required to achieve that. To restore the configuration, just like backing up, same place, system settings, within the system information widget and within the system configuration section within that widget. As you can see, I've clicked the restore here, and it's asking me to pick a file to restore and enter the password if it's applicable. We also have two additional options, which is to overwrite the current IP, routing and HA settings, or as you can see, what's grayed out selected by default is to restore in offline mode. Now the first one, the overwrite current IP, routing and HA settings, this is the default. If it's on, it will restore the entire configuration including network settings. So you need to think to yourself, if the network settings are different, to untick that. Otherwise, you may find if you restore the configuration, old network settings will also be restored and connectivity may be lost. As always, it's recommended to ensure that when you restore back up, you are connected to the local console port and not doing this remotely. If you turn it off, only the contents of the FortiManager will be restored and not the network setting. The restore in offline mode is enabled by default. The offline mode stops the FortiGate to FortiManager protocol running on TCP 541. This essentially ensures that no one is actually configuring a FortiGate when you restore the configuration, as it disables that communication protocol. Last but not least, I just want to have a discussion around what we've learned in this lesson. We started by having a look at the differences between a virtual machine and a physical deployment. We then jumped into the use cases of an enterprise and SMB versus a managed security service provider. We looked about where you would deploy a FortiManager within your network. We confirmed it had to be behind the FortiGate with either port forwarding or a VIP setup. We then went into accessing the FortiManager and what the default settings of a FortiManager looks like. We logged into one and we played around with the basic network settings and viewed how it's been set up currently. And then we touched base on up and actually restoring the configuration of a FortiManager. I hope this video has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. If it's been helpful, please do like, subscribe and leave a comment. Thank you.